Alrighty, looks like the recording has started.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Call this meeting of the Assembly Committee on Homelessness to order. Today is Wednesday, November 18th. It's 11 o'clock. We will go ahead and call the roll and then get started. Thank you.
Alrighty, Miss Allard,
Here.
Mr. Constant, Mr. Dunbar,
Here.
Miss Kennedy, Miss LaFrance, Mr. Perez Verdia, Mr. Peterson, Mr. Rivera,
Present.
Mr. Weddleton, and Miss Altel.
Here. Thank you, Travis. So our agenda today, I did not receive any initial audience participation requests. So we're going to jump right into our business for the day, which is we're going to learn about the Reentry Coalition, and then we're going to get an update on the winter sheltering plan. We do have an item for the committee and legislative budget priorities to raise, and then we'll do audience participation. So with that, I would turn it over to Jonathan with the Reentry Coalition and NeighborWorks Alaska. I know he's got a presentation for us, so please take it away, Jonathan. Jonathan, can you hear us? I can see you. I'm not sure he can hear us. All right, well, I'm going to see if I can reach him. Is Miss Burke or Mr. Bach? Is Miss Burke or Mr. Bockenstead on? We could reverse the order here and start with winter sheltering plan update.
Meg, I'm on. This is Nancy.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead? We'll reverse the order and we'll do that first. Please go ahead.
Okay. Apologies. One moment. I'm going to sign on with a second device. And is it okay to put up my slides on the screen?
Yes, of course. Oh, Jonathan's got his audio on now. Okay, actually, Nancy, let's just keep our order going. Perfect.
Okay.
Technology is always challenging. I'm still learning. So, Jonathan, please go ahead, introduce yourself, and you're welcome to share your screen. You've got the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're coming through fine.
All right, thank you. So please bear with me while I attempt this. Are you able to see my PowerPoint?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. My name is Jonathan Postotnik. I am the coordinator for the Anchorage Reentry Coalition. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. A little bit more about the Reentry Coalition and about reentry in Anchorage and sort of tying that into housing and homelessness. So this is a presentation that I typically deliver to people in the community to sort of convey, to tell more about the coalition, to talk about reentry. Hopefully you'll have a better understanding about reentry at the end of this presentation. And given the focus of this committee, I'm going to hone in on the issue of housing and homelessness as I progress through this presentation. So if we were in person, I would be sort of asking all of you to sort of give me some input on what you think of when you hear the word reentry. And I've learned that it's important to clarify that when I'm talking about reentry, it's specifically referring to prisoner reentry. And it is that act of an individual leaving incarceration and coming back to the community. but it also, in a sense, it kind of refers to those programs and services and people that are assisting along the way, facilitating that process that the individual goes through when they come back to the community. And so, even if you're not familiar with reentry, I've discovered in my time that, you know, not everybody understands what it looks like when somebody releases from incarceration and comes back to the community. But you probably have seen it in popular culture. This is actually a depiction of a reentry. This was from Ocean's 11. I think it came out in like 1999.
Ocean's 11. It came out in like 1999.
Sorry, a little feedback. Here in this scene, George Clooney is getting released from the penitentiary. He's got a car waiting for him. He's got his cool friend in the front, the babe in the back. They all kind of have sort of a, I don't know, sheepish look. And they drive off to sort of some whimsical music. It's a little bit lighthearted, and they're going to go plan another caper, and it's all good. But it's been my experience that it doesn't usually look like this. It could, but if you talk to enough people who have come back to the community after being incarcerated, you'll hear stories of happiness and jubilation, but you also hear stories about anxiety, fear of the unknown. There's a lot of uncertainty that often comes with reentry. And so what I try to convey to folks is that it's oftentimes a very complex issue. It's not so straightforward as you might think for someone to leave incarceration. And, you know, not surprisingly, every situation is different. Every person has their own sort of unique set of circumstances and situations that sort of led to that moment, to that situation. And not everyone everyone has a unique situation. And so there are common themes that you'll find if you talk to people and you sort of understand like what assistance they may need or what their situation may be. But it's not accurate to say that, you know, everyone that goes into prison or jail has a problem with alcohol or drugs. Not everybody is homeless. Not everybody is a college dropout. But on the whole, you will find common themes that run throughout this situation. That said, I think it's important to sort of frame the situation a little bit. Generally, if you look at the population of incarcerated people and you compare that to just a sample of the public at large, you will find lower socioeconomic status. So you will find lower levels of education, lower incomes, lower skill development. And I think with that, understanding that if you are lower socioeconomic status, you are more predisposed to certain risk factors, and that's prior to becoming incarcerated. So you probably have a greater likelihood of having lived in poverty, experienced violence and trauma, living in poorer neighborhoods with fewer resources, and being exposed potentially to sort of environmental hazards. So these are risk factors that could come into play even before someone becomes incarcerated and removes them from society. And so I put this slide together. This is just some of the various sectors and professions, types of services that could somehow be engaged in this reentry process. As I was looking at this in preparation for this meeting, I realized I don't think I have policymakers on here. I think that that's another key piece. So you could keep adding to this, this graphic to find and parse out other services that aren't represented. But you can see how diverse and how wide-ranging reentry can be potentially. So just a quick pitch for the Reentry Coalition. My position, like I said, I'm the coalition coordinator. My position is funded by the Alaska Mental Health Trust. This is a full-time position, and I have counterparts in 3 other communities around the state. There's coalition coordinators in Juneau, the Mat-Su, and Fairbanks. This coalition has existed at least back to like 2007 is my understanding. It was kind of a loose-knit coalition at first, and then over time, about 2016, I believe, the Mental Health Trust began to sort of fund this position. It became a little bit more formalized. So I'm engaged in community organizing around prisoner reentry, and I work with a lot of the partners that you saw represented on that last slide. I do work to sort of keep this coalition going, so it's sort of that internal facing capacity building. I have a steering team that I work with, and I have some deliverables for the trust, but I also have my sort of, I'll say, external facing activities where, you know, I do things like this, do education in the community about reentry. My partners and I were responsible for hosting reentry simulations. That was a overwhelming success pre-COVID. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to do those since COVID came through. I was engaged in going into some of the institutions and some of the prisons around the state to engage with individuals while they were incarcerated to try to inform them about the services that were available out here in the community. I engage in advocacy. I have a website and a Facebook page, so I'm kind of trying to keep a presence there. So there's kind of a lot of different things happening all over the place. I host coalition meetings. Everyone's welcome to attend. The next one is December 3rd at 9:30 a.m. And that's when I host these meetings to convene stakeholders and interested parties. We just talk about reentry programs, opportunities, issues. It's an opportunity to come together. I was doing those in person, but like everyone else, I've kind of had to pivot to a virtual space on Zoom. So that's just some of what the coalition does and what I do in my position. So now I kind of want to hone in a little bit more on this housing and homelessness topic. And so I guess I just want to make it clear that, you know, these two basic assumptions I think shouldn't be too far afield, but shelter is a basic human necessity. And of course, when somebody leaves prison, they have been housed in prison or jail. And when they leave there, they're going to have a place to live and to be sheltered. I think depending on where you're at in the process, you may have to or you may overlook that fact. So on a national level, there's not actually a whole ton of systematic data on the issue of reentry and homelessness. The data is a little sparse, but the Prison Policy Initiative advocacy group, they're based in Massachusetts, and in 2018 they put out a paper. They were able to get some national data, and they were able to articulate some of these figures that basically people that have been incarcerated are much more likely to become homeless than the general public. And in this paper, they addressed kind of these sort of segmented populations within that. So the housing insecurity. So you get those folks that are like kind of the stereotypical sleeping on the sidewalk with a tent, pushing a cart, like just straight up unsheltered homeless folks. There are some people that release from prison and they go straight into homelessness. There is a portion of people that will go to a place like a homeless shelter. But then there's also a larger segment of people that are marginally housed. And these are people, in the paper, they talk about places such as a motel or maybe some transitional living places. They're very transitory in nature. I think that there's a large portion of people that release from incarceration and sort of end up in that situation where they're living in a place, they're off the street, but they're not housed in a stable long-term situation. And I think that goes like on a national level, but also sort of on a state and local level here in Alaska and Anchorage. And so there's a variety of reasons why someone might find it difficult to find not just a place to live, but like a safe and stable place to live, sort of medium to long term. And I don't think that, I mean, if you work with the homeless population, like some of these bullet points, they're common across these different, segments of the population. But I think that it could kind of add up if you're coming from incarceration. Of course, there's the financial aspects, like you need the money to be able to rent, you need to possibly put down a deposit. But if you've been incarcerated, you may have no credit. It may be terrible. Your identity may have been stolen. You may not have references because you've been locked up. The background check, not only might you be found disqualified, but I think I've had to pay for a background check, or at least a credit check in my previous rental situation. So that could be a stumbling block for some. There's both programmatic and sort of formal and discretionary policies that could exclude certain people from certain programs. I think I'll point out here that somebody that's been incarcerated for a long period of time may not fit the definitions set forth by HUD about whether they qualify as being homeless, even if they have no place to live. They don't meet some of the chronic homelessness criteria. Finding the right place to live is challenging. Not only there has to be just the basic availability, but location and proximity to the networks that may be a positive influence or actually a negative influence is a factor also when we're working with this population. And then the ID right now with COVID, I think it's become even harder to obtain basic identification. So that can be a stumbling block immediately when someone gets released. So I'm going to kind of hone in more on the sort of Alaska issues and the information and data. Like I said, there's not a lot of hard data, but if you talk to people that work in this space, you'll hear concerns. People that are intimately aware about this population, you talk to people that have been released, you'll hear it's almost all very common. Housing and employment, those are the two issues that I hear about most frequently when we're talking about reentry services or sort of needs immediately after release. So if when I talk to people in my steering team, people that work very closely on these issues, housing and employment, those are the issues that come up. We are fortunate in Anchorage to have a group of housing providers that will take in people that have been released from incarceration. They tend to be, they're transitional housing providers. There's a smattering of them. They have varying degrees of structure, but they could be very short-term, or they could kind of be medium-term housing programs that could last up to like 6 months. And then the idea is that someone could either stay on a little bit longer, or they could transition into something more stable, something more permanent. But in talking with them, they kind of confirmed my sense that if those housing providers did not exist, that weren't providing beds and places for reentrants, a lot of their residents would otherwise be straight up homeless, or they'd come back and they'd be marginally housed in sort of safe, unstable, more transitory situations. So we're fortunate in Anchorage to have sort of this safety net, this network of housing providers housing this population. And when I was going into the institutions and I would talk to people who are still incarcerated, very frequently they would identify housing and employment as their top two priorities. Even if they had other issues going on, those were the two things that they wanted to talk about or were most concerned about. So I said there's not a lot of data. When I came into my position it was probably about 2 years ago, I put together a survey. I wanted to gather information from people that were incarcerated about what they perceived their needs to be. I've worked in this space previously, like I kind of knew what I was doing. I knew what the issues were, but I wanted to get their take from people that were incarcerated here in Alaska. So the data that you see on here was from a survey that I put together. It was very small sample, like 80 people. It's not super representative because, you know, when I would go into the institutions, I didn't have access to just anyone. It was kind of like the general population people. So people with acute mental health needs, like they're probably not represented within this data. And for my academic types, I'm always clear that this is not research or anything. This was just me going out and gathering some feedback and some information to guide my work, and give me the ability to articulate some of this stuff, some of these issues. And so you'll see that almost a quarter of the respondents identified housing and as a safe place to live as an area of need or an area of concern. And what I always want to point out with this data is, like, you'll see the highest frequencies for responses. These are like basic human necessities: clothing, a job, financial security, ultimately, safe place to live, transportation, food. I think it's important to sort of see that in this context of, like, these are just basic human necessities that people are going to need help with. And it's common. And so I think that if you got a true representative sample, a lot of these numbers would probably go up across the board. But I think that at 3/4, that sounds about right. And so I asked a follow-up question. It was a open-ended write-in question. What do you think will help keep you free and out of jail when you're released? And so this is a word cloud of their responses, and you can see how common, how prominent housing and sort of this idea of shelter, a safe place to live, how that stands out compared to a lot of these other potential issues, potential needs. So why should this matter to me? I think there's a lot of reasons why this issue of reentry should matter to the community. Firstly, here in Anchorage, we get a little bit less than 50% of all people that release from the Department of Corrections. They come here to Anchorage. There's a slight overrepresentation for Anchorage in terms of the number of people releasing compared to other communities, but it's not super disparate. And I have access to a little bit of DOC data, not a lot. I'd love to dig into it more, but there's limitations there. And the information that was shared with me, it indicates that Anchorage is receiving a higher proportion of the highest need, highest risk individuals. And I'm careful not to make like sweeping generalizations when I try to avoid that, but basically Anchorage is receiving a lot of people that, in order to get them on track, in order to get them stable and sort of stable in the community, they will likely need a little bit more, a higher intensity services, more time, probably more hand-holding, more guidance. And so I think that's an important piece of this to understand. Some people are just, they get released and they hit the ground running and they never look back, and you know that they were incarcerated. But then there's others who, they struggle and they want help and they need help. And then another reason, it costs money to incarcerate people, and it's expensive. About $62,000 a year that we're spending to incarcerate people, and instead of investing that money into other services or other resources. And from a racial equity, social justice perspective, Alaska is not immune from the racial inequities that are inherent within the correctional systems in the US. And we have an overrepresentation of Alaskan Natives and African Americans in our correctional system. And so usually I wrap with, making the point that, or making the case that, if we as a community are facilitating successful reentry, and thereby reducing recidivism risks. We are helping to promote public safety. Someone that stabilizes, that stays in the community and gets on track, that's less victims, that's less crime, that's better that integration process, that's public safety. And I added this bullet point, this last one in red for this presentation, that I think housing and prisoner reentry is a very important salient topic. And I think it's important to remember that the housing providers that are taking in these folks that are actively involved in housing reentrants, they're part of this housing safety net as well, and that they should be considered part of this conversation around homelessness. And I want to give a shout out to Partners Reentry Center. They are one of the main conduits for helping to facilitate this housing process along with the housing providers themselves. And their executive director over there, I asked him, how many people do they have housed? And it's about 120 people per month that they help to house. And these are people that have been incarcerated, felonies, misdemeanors. So they're not the only supportive housing program for people that have justice involvement, but they're probably the most prominent here in Anchorage. And we don't, as far as I know, there's no analogous resource or organization within the state. So like I mentioned, how we have this unique set of housing providers that create this safety net. Other communities in Alaska don't have such a I think we could use more, but we have more housing providers working in this space than compared to other communities. And we have a place like PRC to help facilitate placements and sort of manage that financial piece a little bit. So these are assets that we have in our community that are a little bit unique. And I would just add that I think that if we're going to talk about homelessness issues in Anchorage, you can't leave out the criminal justice system. The Department of Corrections, they're involved in this process too. And the pre-release planning that happens in the prisons before somebody gets released, like that's helping to protect against homelessness. And so I think it's important to consider their role in this process and these discussions as well. And lately, well, recently over the years, our recidivism rate has been decreasing. The most recent figure that I saw was a little bit under 60%. It was like 59 point something percent. It'll be interesting to see what happens with that recidivism rate over time with COVID. I'm not really sure if we'll see a tick back up in terms of recidivism rates, but I mean, it can be broken. We can solve these issues if we as a community want to invest in them. And I don't think I don't have a slide in here, I took it out, but other states have lowered their recidivism rates. They've been engaged in criminal justice reform and have addressed this issue head on. And so I think we could do that here as well. And I think that, as I mentioned, the issue of homelessness and sort of reentry and recidivism, they kind of go hand in hand, at least for the population that I work with. And so this is a quote from someone that I work with, another example that, people can change, and with some help, with sort of that sort of self-awareness that they develop, like we can get out of that cycle. So I'll end it on that. Like I said, I'm hosting a meeting on December 3rd. I maintain an email list in which I share information. Happy to add anyone that's interested. And I have a website. There's a little bit more information on there. There's some data, that word cloud, the inmate survey, that those resources are on this website as well. So I appreciate the opportunity to share this morning.
Thank you, Jonathan. To note for the record, we've been joined by Pete Peterson and member Crystal Kennedy. Excuse me, can't talk. So remind members, if you have questions, you can hop into the chat and let me know, and I'll get you in the queue. Jonathan, I have a question for you to kick it off. If you could Do you have any policy recommendations specifically targeted towards housing and homelessness for the reentry population that the assembly or municipality should take a look at?
Off the top of my head, I would say no. I think that examining where those barriers are, like I kind of mentioned that the HUD definitions of homelessness, I think they exclude a lot of people with felonies that have done longer stretches of time while they're incarcerated. And so finding ways to expand definitions of homelessness and to be inclusive in our policies to include this population. I think I don't have a specific policy to point at, but I think just considering sort of that area important.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really great insight for us to know. And then have you seen any housing instability amongst reentrants, particularly related to COVID-19? I know you were talking about kind of folks who piece together housing for themselves. Have you seen a greater reliance on shelter or other options based on COVID-19 effects? Oh, and I need to note for the record, it looks like we've been joined by Ms. Allard as well. Thank you.
It's kind of hard to know exactly because my reentry partners and I think we have relied very heavily on face-to-face interactions, and so on the whole, I don't think this is super unique to my partners, but it's been hard to maintain communication, and a lot of the housing providers that are engaged in this work, they're very small operations. And so they may have just a handful of staff. And so I don't have a great answer for you in terms of the instability. Early on, I was hearing that people that had been released were abiding by the rules, and they were trying to stay in the community because going back to prison right now or back to jail was really not ideal with COVID because there's no programming that's happening. There's everything's on lockdown basically from what I'm hearing. So I think that there was a greater sense of like, hey, we need to make sure we're on track with our programming here so that we can maintain our stability in these housing opportunities. I don't have a lot more to add on that. But Partners Reentry Center, like I said, they're kind of the main hub here locally, and so some of their case managers and their staff would have a better understanding of that issue.
Great, thanks. Thank you so much for joining us today and for this great information. It's an area the committee hasn't explored in recent history, so I really appreciate you help filling out this picture for us of those in need and have housing and challenges in that area. So with that, I don't see any questions from you from other members, but they have your information and the PowerPoint is on the committee's website. So with that, we'll go ahead and move on to our next item in the agenda, the update on the winter sheltering plan. And I believe we have Nancy Burke and Jason Bockenstead with us today.
Yes, good morning. I'll kick off. I have 3 slides to review with the committee today, and then I'll queue up questions or conversation for other members who are on. The update was requested for what's happening in our adult homeless services system, and I think the first presentation was a really excellent lead into this conversation, because as you can see by our chart, we are seeing more people this year than we've seen in years past in our homeless adult service system. I'm just focusing on adults today. I think the family and the youth systems remain very stable and are functioning quite well and worthy of conversation of their own, but for today, because we continue to have to change and adapt in the adult system, I'm just focusing on the adults. I updated the slides that I sent over to the committee, and I'll resend this slide with one additional data point from today. And as you can see, we continue to climb in numbers of persons in our adult service system. This chart is a historical chart from the date when we started using the automatic reporting tool that was set up by the I-team to collect how many people were physically in shelter each night. The Homeless Management Information System collects deeper information and has more breadth to it, but this is just a simple census tool that we use in the community. We started in April of 2019, so we captured the tail end of the 2019 winter, and then we used it through the 2019-2020 winter, and now going into 2020-2021. So this information is only 1 year of data, but as we believe, territory in terms of homeless persons in our system. Just a reminder of where the resources are, and you'll notice that the number that we have total available listed as our capacity is matching today's census number. And one line that I'll point out to you, that the emergency contract at the Sullivan Arena in the middle of the chart here, which is listed at 360, has been over on that number every night for about the past month. Last night, that number was 407. And so we strive to drive that number down by bringing on additional resources. And you can see the two lines that are highlighted below the Sullivan Arena number, the use of non-congregate units for hotels and the use of now additional space at a new location for congregate shelter. And I'll just say a word about how we're bringing on these resources. We're bringing them on as fast as we can. We are responding to what is a crisis right now with people in the adult system. We're bringing on non-congregate locations to accommodate people who the Center for Disease, the CDC has recommended, who may be at greater risk of dying from the virus, those who have underlying medical or immune system challenges, and those individuals over 65. So you can see in October and November, we have brought on a number of non-congregate hotel rooms to accommodate those persons, and now opening a new congregate location because we just cannot keep up with the numbers as they're coming in. Why the numbers are coming in higher this year is a very interesting question. As you saw, we only have 1 year of data collection on our census tool. So we've only been tracking it very closely for that period of time. However, there are things that we've known about the system that we have not been able to adapt our data processes to adequately capture. And so there are three reasons why we think people may be, we may be seeing more people in the service system. One is that we may see more people who traditionally would have found other locations in the community that they could remain safe. These would be places like hospital lobby areas, locations that are open 24 hours a day. Many of those locations are limited this year or are not open. And so it could be that we're just finally getting all of the people who are unsheltered in the community into shelter. It could also be that people are not cycling as much as they may have done in other years. We know that people, as the last presenter said, they use informal networks. They may have money for a hotel for a period of time and then cycle back into the homeless services system. Or they oftentimes, not often, but we do hear stories anecdotally of people who will commit a crime so that they are incarcerated over the coldest parts of the winter. This chart that is in front of you now shows the unduplicated client count for a 2-month review period from September 1st through November 5th. This is what we talk about as the amount of cycling of people through our shelter locations. So through the beginning of November, we had roughly 3 times the persons cycling through the service system at this one site at the Sullivan Arena. Then we had cots available for people. So this is how we know that people use other resources. They may use informal networks to house themselves for a period of time and then cycle back through homelessness. The third theory of why we may be seeing people coming in is this column here on the right that is newly identified people. People who are new to us in the service system, maybe people who previously had jobs but have lost them due to economic conditions of decreased activity in our community. So these could be people who are now newly unhoused because of COVID and because of the economic crisis we're having. We will continue to ask the Homeless Coalition to help us review this data and to provide more detailed information about the people we're seeing in the service system as we go forward into the winter so that we can begin to plan for responses that are needed. I'll take a break there to see if there are questions.
Thank you. We do have a question. Mr. Dunbar, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure if this was something that you were already going to talk about, Nancy, but if you could mention it now. So there was a news report about, potential fatalities in the unsheltered community that came out a few weeks ago. Maybe it was even a couple months ago at this point. But I am curious. I learned a number of years ago that, sort of to my surprise, it's not something we frequently talk about or report out, but since the weather has turned, or taking any frame of time that you want to use, have we had fatalities in the unsheltered population from exposure, I should say?
This is an area that it is a priority going forward to attempt to address. We have not, I personally have not heard of any fatalities recently. I think we do find in the coldest part of winter that everyone goes on alert. The police go into a different mode of people. Everyone is more attentive to persons who may be outside during these very cold periods, and we make sure that there is room available. But there are challenges in tracking deaths that happen. For instance, if a person is found deceased outdoors, it may be recorded in the data, the actual physical event that led to their death, rather than it being categorized as a homelessness death. I know the Homeless Coalition is talking about this, and the health department has been, thinking about it. And I think going forward, it's a policy area that needs focus.
Thank you.
Okay, we have no other questions right now. You can go ahead with the presentation, please.
I think there have just been questions about, how do we go forward from here if this trend, which is roughly an 18% increase over the last 2 months, the EOC is, our lead in planning for spaces and resources. You can expect to see us bring on some measure of both kinds of resources, congregate and non-congregate shelter, so that we can address vulnerable priority populations, but also just keep up with the pace that we're seeing. And so that will be a future activity that will happen. You'll notice on our chart that we did bring on Fairview Recreation Center as a congregate location, and we'll be able to stay stay within the CDC recommendations of going up to 49 people at that location. And we will continue to just balance these needs of vulnerable populations and the growing need if we do not see a decline in that growth curve.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions for Ms. Burke about winter sheltering plan? I have one. So it seems as though we had the presentation, I believe, last month on the winter sheltering plan. This is an update. It seems like we're still utilizing the same plan, which is a combination of the Sullivan Arena, trying to decompress that through non-congregate opportunities, and then utilization of rapid rehousing to get folks out of the shelter system. Is that still a fair characterization? We've just had to expand some of the way stations in the meantime while we ramp up the rapid rehousing?
Yes, absolutely. And you know, the pool of people responding is still the same. So all of these adding new locations, adding new sites is a drain on personnel. You know, it takes our attention. We're just responding to a crisis. What we need to do is make sure that we're pushing forward to look at those rapid rehousing opportunities and maintain focus on those programs so that we can, you know, ultimately solve our problem of having too many people in the system. But we remain, you know, we're a small city and we only have a certain number of people to pull in. So balancing all the things right now, I think, is our main priority.
Thank you. We have a question for Mr. Gates. Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me okay there?
Yes.
Just a sec. Okay. Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to ask Mrs. Brooke, we also have our temporary emergency sheltering plan and code and municipal code chapter 16/120. I'm not sure if the churches and social service agencies that have signed up to provide some shelter, overnight shelter under that plan are included here in the report. Is there some status of how many we have ready for this winter?
I think that's a very interesting question. I know that there's been some conversation in the EOC about responding specifically to the needs of COVID and how that sometimes is a little different from like a fire or an earthquake. And so there are some differences between the main emergency response plan and what's happening. I don't have the specific information on how this disaster adheres to the other disaster roadmaps, but I could ask for that information and get back to you on that.
Well, I just asked out of curiosity, but if the committee would like the information, up to that, I'm sure.
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Gates. Are there any other questions for Ms. Burke? And then is there anyone else from the administration that wanted to add any information to the winter sheltering plan at this point? Okay, seeing and hearing none, we will move on to the excuse me, the next item in the agenda, which is legislative and budget priorities. I wanted to flag one item, not to necessarily take up today, but something we're working toward and we'll want to keep bringing through this committee is a state and local coordination of resources and long-term funding agenda. This has come up in relationship to just looking forward to the state budget, how we take the municipal investment, coordinate it with state resources as we move forward, as well as what that coordination may mean and look like in terms of policy as we explore the anchored home plan again, and as it gets refined, that comes up in 2021. So does anyone else have anything they would like to put in the state and legislative priorities for the committee to consider moving forward? Okay, seeing nothing. Also, there's an intention not to meet in December, but to then jump into these issues starting in January. Okay, any committee comments before we turn to audience participation? Quiet bunch today. Okay, so with that, we'll turn to audience participation. I'll have Mr. Turner try to assist us. If you'd like to speak, go ahead and unmute yourself or *6, and we will take first come, first serve, 3 minutes per individual.
Yes, I'm online.
Okay, is
Can
this
you
Mr.
hear me,
Oliva?
Nick?
Yes, I can. Is this Mr. Oliva?
Yes, am I in the queue?
You are first. You may go ahead.
Okay, well, first of all, I enjoyed the presentation about reentry. Judge Rhodes used to do a seminar, and I tried to sign up for it in the pandemic, threw a wrench in it, presented by prisoners. The gentleman who presented, I don't think he did any time. And I have 132 years of hard time on my staff. So I know where they're coming from and somewhat how to treat them. The last one went beyond my limits because he was convicted of rape, but it was his girlfriend, and that's like a Spenard divorce. You don't have to throw him in jail if he shot his wife. I mean, he's not going to shoot anyone else. So I need to be educated in interviewing them, because the last guy who had 50 years served 22. I got him out of the rain on Ingress Street up by the old Native Hospital. I bunked him for 3 days, but I had to give him a key. He ended up stealing my tools. It happens. I'm not going to get him back, but you have to trust and verify. Now, this reentry, the rapist had no chance of getting a job or housing. He lives with his parents. Brain fart, whatever happened. Hey, how do I talk to them, deal with them? And when they're long-term incarcerated, especially with drugs, they'll live in a Connex. They'll live anywhere because it reminds them of home, the Gray Bar Hotel. So I know my 3 minutes may be up, but the reentry program is real important for the labor force, how to talk to them, if there's after effects, how to trust them. I've been in prison. I talked to these guys. I know how the correction officers behave, and hey, you assembly members can ride in the front seat of a police car and watch what the policeman says, but be turned upside down and cuffed and thrown in jail, demod, and then you understand not all those people in there deserve to be in there, and as soon as they get out, they have to heal, and who's ever helping them has to have the tools to know how to deal with trust and verify, because it was very sad. And I got to tell you, day laborers, when you interview these people, my interview process is I ask them what color checkers are, the game of checkers. Believe me, you wouldn't believe the answers I get other than red and black.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Oliva.
Do you have any questions? Do you have any questions?
Just one moment, please. Mr. Dunbar. Not a question for you, Mr. Oliva, but a comment from Mr. Dunbar, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And yeah, I don't have a question, but usually we let folks give their comments without having any response from the body or from the committee. But I think it's important, while we appreciate Ron's work on folks experiencing reentry, and there's some merit to what he says about recidivism and reentry, I think we all categorically reject and condemn, or certainly I do, I don't want to speak for others, what he said about Spinard divorces and downplaying violence against women, and potentially sexual violence as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Dunbar. I appreciate that. You beat me to the punch. So anyone else would like to participate today?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Haberman.
Thank you. Let's just start my timer. One, I would like to compliment you all, family members, on your efforts to deal with the homeless issue. You've been consistent, and I'm not saying you've handled it perfectly, but I applaud you for addressing the homeless issue, particularly with what's going on now with COVID. Compared to that, out in the borough, I don't recall a single time that the borough assembly meetings do they ever, Matsu, ever address homelessness. But you continue to address it, and I, again, thank you for that. But I'd like to add this key thing to you all and remind you, when you deal with the COVID situation and how you handle it, and remind you the situation has been that businesses out there in Anchorage and elsewhere are wondering if they're going to be in business tomorrow. People are going to wondering if they're going to have a job tomorrow. This needs to be addressed. You need to appropriately address it in such a way, because you are going to be increasing homelessness if you're not having a handle on how you handle COVID. That needs to be addressed every time you have a meeting, and I'm not just talking about the homeless issue, but how you handle the COVID issue. And I'll leave you with that, except for one thing. Just before me getting online, they kept on unmuting me during the time of audience participation when I always mute myself regularly. So I don't know what was going on, who was pressing buttons there, but it created a situation where if you asked if there's anyone else on the line, had I not continually unmute myself during the audience participation, you would have ended the meeting because you would have heard no one being able to say, hey, I'm here. And thank you very much with all the respect, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Mr. Haberman. Thank you for the feedback on the technical issues. So anyone else like to participate? Okay, hearing no one, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. We are adjourned.
Thanks.